The summer heat of 1885 pressed down on Kansas like the weight of unfinished business. Marcus Sullivan sat in his study at Copper Creek Ranch, staring at a photograph that time had bleached to sepia shadows. Ellen's smile looked back at him across 12 years of silence, her hand resting on 8-year-old Mary's shoulder, both of them frozen in a moment when the world still made sense. The whiskey glass beside the photograph remained untouched, as it had every evening for the past month. Some habits die harder than others, and Marcus had learned that drowning memories only made them float back stronger. The amber liquid caught the lamplight like liquid gold, a temptation he'd resisted through sheer stubborn will and the knowledge that Ellen would have boxed his ears for giving in to weakness. A letter from Judge Harrison Fletcher lay folded beneath the frame, its words burned into Marcus's mind. Marcus, the railroad is buying land throughout the territory. Be careful with Garrett Stone. The transcontinental line's completion has changed everything. Men like him see opportunity where others see home. Trust your instincts. Your old friend, Harrison. Marcus lifted his weathered hand to trace the badge pinned to the photograph's corner, his sheriff's star from a lifetime ago. The metal was tarnished now, but the weight of responsibility it represented had never diminished. Through the window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and his rancher's instincts read the signs with the precision of a man who'd survived 30 years on the frontier. Low pressure bringing wind shifts, the kind of weather that drove cattle to shelter and brought trouble riding hard across the prairie. But this trouble had been 12 years in the making. The flashback hit him like summer lightning, sudden and illuminating. 1873. Sheriff Marcus Sullivan, 42 years old and still believing justice could be clean and simple. He'd stood in the Last Chance Saloon, badge-catching lamplight, facing down reports that his oldest friend was stealing from the county treasury. The saloon had gone quiet when he walked in, the kind of silence that meant everyone knew something bad was about to happen. Garrett Stone had built half of Dodge City with his bare hands, fought beside Marcus through 3 years of Civil War hell, stood as best man at his wedding to Ellen McKenna. They'd homesteaded together, their families sharing meals and dreams of civilization blooming in the wilderness. Marcus could still remember the taste of Ellen's cornbread at their shared Sunday dinners, the sound of Mary's laughter mixing with the Stone children's voices in the yard. Ellen begged me not to investigate, Marcus whispered to the empty room, his voice roughened by years of keeping that secret. She said I had a wife and daughter to think about, said some truths weren't worth dying for. He'd told her then what he still believed now, standing in their kitchen with the investigation papers spread across the table like accusations. A man does what's right, Ellen, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. If good men don't stand up to corruption, what kind of world are we leaving for Mary? Ellen's green eyes had filled with tears that night, but she'd nodded understanding. Then you do what you must, Marcus Sullivan. But you come home to us, you hear? You come home safe. The promise he'd made that night echoed in the empty room, a vow he'd kept in the most bitter way possible. The memory dissolved as hoofbeats thundered into the yard, desperate and uneven. Marcus was on his feet and moving before conscious thought caught up, his Colt .45 Peacemaker sliding into his hand with the smooth certainty of 30 years' practice. The weapon was a thing of beauty and function, custom-gripped walnut handles worn smooth by his palm, the action tuned to perfection by Tom Murphy's skilled hands. 6 rounds of .45 long Colt ammunition, each one capable of dropping a man at 50 yards. Through the window, he saw a horse, lathered and trembling, its rider slumped forward in the saddle. Not a rider at all, he realized with growing alarm. A woman, barely conscious, clinging to life and leather with equal desperation. The horse was quality stock, well-bred and well cared for, definitely property of the church judging by the simple but sturdy tack. Marcus burst through the front door as she slid from the horse's back, landing in the dust with the boneless weight of someone beyond exhaustion. Her torn veil caught on a dead branch like a surrendered flag, and where her religious habit should have been, only 3 large leaves pressed against trembling skin provided any modesty. Dear God in heaven, Marcus breathed, his combat-trained eyes taking in the evidence of violence with clinical precision learned in field hospitals during the war. Bruises darkened her throat in the clear pattern of finger marks, the kind that spoke of hands large enough to encircle her neck completely. Blood had dried on her thighs, and dirt ground into open wounds told the story of being dragged across rough ground. Her fingernails were broken and bloody from fighting back. He'd seen such injuries before, during the war and in his sheriff days. This was no accident or fall from a horse. This was calculated brutality, the kind that left scars on soul as well as body. The woman's eyes snapped open as he approached, wild with terror that cut straight through his chest like a Bowie knife. When he reached out instinctively to help, she recoiled with a cry that seemed to tear itself from her very soul. "Please stop doing that forbidden thing." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, transporting him instantly back in 12 years. Ellen's voice echoed across time. "Please stop doing that dangerous thing, Marcus. Think about Mary." His hand froze in midair, and for a heartbeat, past and present blurred together like watercolors in rain. Two women, two desperate pleas, two chances to protect someone precious. The similarity was so uncanny it made his chest tighten with old grief and new purpose. "Easy now," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the calm register he had once used to talk down armed drunks and spooked horses. The tone came from years of experience with frightened animals and desperate people, low and steady and carrying no threat. "I'm not going to hurt you, miss. My name's Marcus Sullivan. This is my ranch, and you're safe here." He stepped back slowly, giving her space to breathe, to think, to decide whether he represented safety or another threat. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he could see the heat shimmer rising from the packed earth of the yard. From his years as both sheriff and battlefield medic, Marcus recognized the symptoms of severe shock with painful clarity. Rapid pulse visible in her throat, pupils dilated despite the bright sunlight, trembling that spoke of the body's desperate attempt to process trauma it couldn't understand. "I'm going to take off my coat," he said slowly, suiting action to words with deliberate care. "I'll lay it on the ground here between us. You can take it if you want. No hurry. Take all the time you need." The long duster hit the dust with a soft thump, the leather worn smooth by years of frontier use. Marcus backed away another step, his hands visible and empty, letting her control the distance between them. The coat was quality work, thick enough to provide warmth and coverage, long enough to preserve her dignity. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, she moved forward on unsteady legs. Her fingers, he noticed with the observational skills of a longtime lawman, were soft despite the calluses of outdoor work. Educated hands, a woman who read books and wrote letters, not just someone who scrubbed floors and tended livestock. The calluses were recent, probably from convent work rather than a lifetime of hard labor. She wrapped the coat around herself with shaking fingers, and something in her shoulders shifted. Not much, but enough for her to draw a full breath for the first time since arriving. The simple act of being covered seemed to return some measure of her humanity to her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the educated accent of the eastern cities. Boston, Marcus guessed from the precise diction. Maybe Harvard territory, the kind of voice that belonged in drawing rooms and lecture halls, not in the dust of a frontier ranch yard. "Can you tell me your name, miss?" "Sister Catherine Rose O'Sullivan." The formal introduction seemed to steady her, gave her something familiar to hold on to in a world that had suddenly become alien and threatening. "I was traveling from the convent in Abilene to the mission in Dodge City when—" Her voice faltered, unable to complete the sentence. Marcus nodded, filing away the information with practiced efficiency. 26 years old, he estimated, from her voice and bearing. Irish heritage, probably second generation given the slight trace of accent. The kind of woman who'd joined the sisters not from lack of options, but from genuine calling. Educated, probably beyond the norm for women of her generation. "Sister, I need to get you inside where my housekeeper can tend to you proper. Can you walk or should I carry you?" The flash of panic in her eyes answered that question immediately. Physical contact, especially from a man, would send her straight back into terror. He'd seen enough victims of violence to recognize the signs. "Martha," Marcus called toward the house, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed in emergencies. "Martha Wilson, I need you out here now." The front door opened immediately, and a sturdy woman in her 60s emerged, gray hair pinned severely back under a practical bonnet and flour dusting her apron. Martha Wilson had been running Copper Creek Ranch since Ellen's death, serving as cook, nurse, surrogate mother, and general voice of reason. Her Irish ancestry showed in the set of her jaw and the fire in her green eyes when confronted with injustice. One look at Catherine told Martha everything she needed to know. The older woman's face hardened with the particular rage that comes to those who've seen too much senseless cruelty in their lifetime. Mother of God, Martha breathed in her native Gaelic, then switched to English with characteristic practicality. Inside, child. Hot water, clean clothes, safe place to sit. We'll sort the rest later. As Martha gently guided Catherine toward the house, speaking in low, soothing tones about herb tea and warm baths, Marcus caught his housekeeper's eye. A slight nod confirmed what they both suspected. This wasn't some random attack by road bandits or drifters. This had been personal, deliberate, and calculated to cause maximum damage. While Martha settled Catherine in the guest room that still smelled of lavender sachets Ellen had made years ago, Marcus tended to her horse with the automatic care of someone who understood that good animals deserve better than the cruelty of men. The horse was indeed well-bred and well cared for, definitely property of the church judging by the simple brass nameplate that read, Convent of the Sacred Heart, Abilene. But as he removed the saddle, checking for injuries and providing water, something caught his attention. A silver coin, lodged in the leather of the saddlebag where it couldn't have fallen by accident. Marcus's blood went cold as Winter Creek water when he recognized the distinctive design. An 1878 Morgan silver dollar from the Carson City Mint, one of the rarest and most distinctive coins in the territory. There were perhaps 500 such coins in the entire region, and Marcus knew exactly who owned most of them. Marcus turned the coin over in his weathered palm, feeling the weight of silver and implication. His mind raced back 12 years, to the night Ellen and Mary died, to the bucket brigade that couldn't save his home despite every able-bodied man in the county fighting the flames, to the investigation that found faulty chimney work and ruled the fire accidental despite his protests, to the silver coin, exactly like this one, that the fire marshal had dismissed as coincidence when Marcus found it in the ashes. "Son of a bitch," Marcus whispered, the profanity torn from him by the sudden clarity of understanding. The pattern was crystal clear now, had been staring him in the face for over a decade. Garrett didn't just eliminate business rivals or political threats. He eliminated anyone who might interfere with his plans, and he eliminated their families to make sure there would be no revenge. And he left his signature behind like some twisted artist signing his work. "Mr. Marcus?" Marcus turned to find Samuel Mitchell approaching from the stable, a young man of 23 who'd been more son than employee for the past 12 years. Samuel had been 11 when his parents died in the cholera outbreak of 1873, and Marcus had taken him in without question or hesitation. Tall and lean, with the steady hands of someone who'd learned to shoot, rope, and ride from a master, Samuel represented everything Marcus hoped to pass on to the next generation. His dark hair needed cutting, and his clothes bore the honest stains of ranch work, but his eyes held the integrity that Marcus had worked to instill in him. "Trouble, sir?" Samuel asked, reading the tension in Marcus's shoulders with the intuition of someone who'd learned to watch for danger in a harsh land. "The worst kind." Marcus held up the silver coin, watching Samuel's face change as understanding dawned. "Remember what I taught you about reading sign?" Samuel nodded gravely. Marcus had trained him to track everything from missing cattle to escaped prisoners, teaching him that the smallest details often told the biggest stories. A bent blade of grass could reveal which direction riders had passed. A particular way of tying knots could identify which outlaw band had been through an area. And certain signatures could connect crimes across years and miles. This coin didn't end up in that saddlebag by accident. Someone put it there deliberate-like, probably while Sister Catherine was— Marcus's jaw tightened like a steel trap. While she was being hurt. Understanding dawned in Samuel's eyes like sunrise over the prairie. The same someone who's been watching the ranch? For 3 days, Samuel had been reporting signs of surveillance that made Marcus's old sheriff instincts prickle with warning. Expensive boot prints in the mud near their water source, the kind that cost more than most men made in a month. Places where someone had sat for hours in the shade, watching the house through field glasses. The kind of careful reconnaissance that spoke of planning rather than casual curiosity. Get inside, Marcus said, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who'd learned to trust his instincts about danger. We need to talk to Sister Catherine about what she remembers, and then we need to prepare for visitors. As if summoned by his words, dust appeared on the eastern horizon like a herald of approaching trouble. 4 riders, moving at the confident pace of men who owned whatever they surveyed and expected no opposition to their will. Marcus didn't need a spyglass to know who led them. He'd recognize that particular combination of arrogance and authority from 5 miles away. Garrett Stone was coming to call. Marcus checked his Colt with the automatic precision of long practice, ensuring a round was chambered and the action was smooth. The weapon had never failed him in 30 years, and he'd maintained it with religious care. 12 years of grief and unanswered questions were about to get very complicated, and he intended to be ready for whatever came next. Through the kitchen window, he caught a glimpse of Catherine sitting at Martha's scrubbed pine table, accepting a cup of chamomile tea with hands that barely shook. Whatever had been done to her, she was fighting her way back to strength with the kind of courage that reminded him why he'd become a lawman in the first place. She was going to need every ounce of that courage in the hours to come. The riders drew closer, and Marcus could make out Garrett's familiar silhouette. Older now, heavier around the middle, wearing the expensive clothes that marked his transition from frontier scrapper to territorial power broker. His hat was genuine felt from St. Louis, and his boots were custom-made leather that probably cost more than most families saw in 6 months. The kind of man who'd found ways to profit from every change the railroad brought, regardless of who got hurt in the process. Behind Garrett rode 3 younger men, all armed with the casual confidence of those who'd never faced real opposition. They wore their guns like jewelry, positioned for show rather than speed, and Marcus knew immediately they'd never been in a situation where fast draw meant the difference between going home and going to ground. Hired muscle, probably from Kansas City or even St. Louis, men who understood intimidation but had never faced down a genuine gunfighter. Marcus stepped onto the front porch, positioning himself where he could cover both the approaching riders and the house behind him. The late afternoon sun was at his back, which would make him harder to see clearly and give him a split-second advantage if things went bad. His right hand hung loose at his side, fingers relaxed but ready to move. "Afternoon, Marcus," Garrett called out as the rider stopped 20 yards from the house. Close enough to talk, far enough to make a fight interesting. "Been too long since we had a proper visit." "Garrett." Marcus kept his voice level, professional, the tone he'd once used when addressing suspects who might or might not cause trouble. "What brings you out to my spread?" "Well now, that's neighborly of you to ask." Garrett's smile was as white and sharp as his silver dollars, practiced and predatory. "We've had reports of a missing horse from our herd, chestnut mare with white stockings. Thought maybe she wandered over this way, seeing as how she was last seen heading in this direction." The lie sat between them like a coiled rattlesnake, obvious to anyone with eyes and dangerous to ignore. Marcus had been watching Garrett's tells for 40 years, and the slight tightness around his eyes meant he was working hard to control his temper. The expensive horse Garrett claimed to be missing was probably safe in his own stable. "Haven't seen any strays," Marcus replied with careful neutrality. "But if I do, I'll be sure to return her to her rightful owner." The emphasis on rightful wasn't lost on anyone present. Garrett's jaw twitched almost imperceptibly, the kind of tell that had cost him money in countless poker games over the years. "There's also been talk," Garrett continued, settling back in his saddle with studied casualness, "of a woman riding through the territory. Some kind of religious person, maybe not entirely stable. The railroad companies expressed concern about vagrants interfering with their survey work." "Railroad company," Marcus repeated, tasting the words like they were bitter medicine. "Funny how their concerns always seem to align with yours, Garrett. Almost like you and them have some kind of understanding." "Progress, Marcus. The railroad's coming whether we like it or not. Smart men position themselves to benefit from change instead of fighting it like stubborn old fools. And not so smart men end up losing their land to eminent domain claims, I suppose. Especially if certain surveys happen to show their property is crucial to the public good." Garrett's smile turned predatory, showing too many teeth. "Now that's an interesting observation. Makes me wonder if you might be harboring someone who could complicate things for all of us. Someone who might have stories to tell that decent folks wouldn't want to hear. From inside the house, Marcus heard the soft creak of floorboards that told him Catherine had moved to a window where she could observe the confrontation. He hoped Martha had the sense to keep her out of direct sight while still allowing her to hear what was being said. "My land's been in the family for 20 years, Marcus said with quiet steel in his voice. "Filed proper with the territorial government. Taxes paid in full every year. Improvements made according to the Homestead Act. No railroad's going to take that away with paperwork tricks and political pressure." 20 years, Garrett mused, as if the number held some special significance. Funny how time changes things, how people's memories get fuzzy about who was where when certain accidents happened. Sometimes new evidence surfaces that changes how folks remember old tragedies. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Garrett was reminding Marcus that the official story of Ellen and Mary's death could be revised if necessary, that a grieving widower might be found culpable for a fire that killed his own family, especially if new evidence surfaced or old witnesses remembered details differently. "Some memories," Marcus said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, "get clearer with age. Sometimes a man realizes he missed important details the first time around. Sometimes he sees patterns he didn't notice before." Behind the window glass, a shadow moved. Catherine had positioned herself where she could hear every word of the conversation while remaining hidden from view. Marcus hoped she was getting a good look at Garrett's face, memorizing his voice for future identification. Legal cases were built on such details. "Well," Garrett said after a moment that stretched like pulled wire, "if you do encounter any wandering church women, you might want to consider the wisdom of Christian charity. Sometimes the kindest thing is to help lost souls find their way back where they belong. Keeps them from getting hurt by staying in places that aren't safe for their kind." The message was as clear as gunpowder smoke. Turn over Catherine or face the consequences that had befallen his family 12 years ago. "I'll keep that in mind," Marcus replied with deadly calm. "Same way I keep in mind that good neighbors respect each other's property and privacy, and that some things a man just won't tolerate, no matter what threats get made." Garrett touched the brim of his expensive hat in a mockery of frontier courtesy. "Always a pleasure talking with you, Marcus. You give my regards to your household, you hear? All of your household." As the riders wheeled their horses and headed back toward town at a leisurely pace that spoke of men confident in their power, one of Garrett's hired guns called out over his shoulder, "Nice spread you got here, Sullivan. Be a real shame if anything happened to it, especially with all this dry weather we've been having." Marcus waited until they were completely out of rifle range before allowing himself to relax even slightly. Through the window, he saw Catherine step back from her observation post, her face pale as moonlight, but set with the kind of determination he'd seen in war veterans and seasoned lawmen. She'd recognize Garrett's voice. Marcus walked back into the house to find Catherine sitting ramrod straight in Martha's kitchen chair, her hands folded in her lap with the precision of someone fighting to maintain control over emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "That was him," she said without preamble, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The man who—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The truth was written in every line of her body. "I know," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful movements of a man who'd learned not to make sudden gestures around traumatized people. "And now he knows you're here." Martha bustled around the kitchen with movements sharp enough to cut glass, her suppressed anger making itself known through the violent way she chopped vegetables and slammed pots onto the stove. "40 years I've known that man, watched him grow from a decent boy into whatever he's become. He's gotten worse with every passing season. But this?" She shook her head, gray curls escaping from their pins. "This is evil wearing a Sunday suit and carrying a prayer book." "Sister Catherine," Marcus said, leaning forward with the intensity of a man who'd learned that details could mean the difference between justice and tragedy, "I need you to know something about me and Garrett Stone, about why he might have targeted you specifically, and why this is about more than just one man's cruelty." Catherine's intelligent eyes focused on him with the intensity of someone accustomed to weighing evidence and reaching logical conclusions. Despite her trauma, her mind was clearly sharp and analytical. 12 years ago, I was sheriff of this county. Garrett was my oldest friend, practically a brother. We'd grown up together, fought in the war together, built this community together. But I was investigating reports that he was skimming tax money from local businesses, maybe involved in some kind of land fraud scheme that was bigger than anything I'd seen before. Marcus paused, feeling the old pain slice through him as sharp as the day it happened. I'd been gathering evidence for 6 months. Financial records, witness testimonies, correspondence that showed a pattern of corruption reaching all the way to Topeka. The night before I was going to arrest him, my house caught fire while I was responding to a fake emergency call about a bank robbery 50 miles away. My wife Ellen and daughter Mary died in the flames. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of Martha's mantel clock and the soft hiss of the kettle on the stove. The official investigation ruled it accidental, Marcus continued, his voice carefully controlled. Faulty chimney work, they said, but I found one of Garrett's silver coins at the scene, just like the one in your saddlebag. I thought it was coincidence then. I know better now. Catherine absorbed this information with the analytical mind of someone trained in logical thinking and legal procedure. You believe he murdered your family to prevent your investigation. I know he did, just like I know what he did to you wasn't random violence committed by some drifter. It was a calculated message, meant to destabilize me emotionally and force me to sell this ranch rather than fight what's coming. The railroad, Catherine said, understanding dawning in her voice like sunrise. Exactly. This ranch sits on the optimal route for their western expansion. Garrett's been systematically acquiring property along the plan right away for the past 3 years, using everything from legitimate offers to outright fraud and intimidation. Anyone who won't sell gets pressured, threatened, or worse, until they change their minds or disappear entirely. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway, his young face grim, with the kind of premature seriousness that came from growing up in harsh circumstances. Mr. Marcus, you need to see this right now. He held up a folded piece of paper, his hand steady despite the gravity of his expression. Found it tacked to the barn door with a Bowie knife. Must have put it there while we were all distracted by the conversation. Marcus unfolded the paper and read the message aloud in a voice that carried the chill of a winter wind. Deliver the woman or Copper Creek Ranch burns like it did 12 years ago. You have 48 hours to decide what matters more, your pride or your property. The silence that followed was broken only by Martha's quiet curse in Gaelic and the distant rumble of thunder from the approaching storm that had been building on the horizon all day. Sister Catherine, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute honesty, I won't lie to you about what we're facing. Staying here puts you in mortal danger from a man who's already proven he's willing to kill entire families to get his way. But running won't solve anything because Garrett has too much reach, too many connections throughout the territory. He'll find you wherever you go, and next time you might not be lucky enough to escape. Catherine straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since her arrival, Marcus saw steel beneath the shock and trauma. The kind of backbone that had carried Irish immigrants across an ocean and women across a continent in search of something better. Mr. Sullivan, there's something you should know about me. Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking truth was giving her back pieces of herself. Before I joined the Sisters of Mercy, I graduated from Harvard Law School. I specialized in land law and criminal procedure. I know how to build a legal case that will stand up in federal court, and I know how to see it through to conviction. The revelation hung in the air like lightning waiting to strike ground. I propose we make a bargain, Catherine continued, her legal training evident in the precise way she structured her proposal. You help me gather evidence against Mr. Stone for what he did to me and others like me. I help you build a federal case that will put him in prison for his crimes against your family and this entire community. Marcus studied her face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read people's true intentions. He was seeing past the physical damage to the sharp intelligence and moral courage beneath. This wasn't just a victim seeking justice. This was an educated, determined woman who'd found her cause and her calling. You realize, he said slowly, weighing each word, that taking on Garrett Stone means taking on the railroad interests, half the territorial government, and every corrupt official he's bought over the years. It's not just dangerous, sister. It's damn near suicidal. Catherine's smile was small but fierce, carrying echoes of the determination that had driven her to law school when most women were expected to marry and raise children. Mr. Sullivan, I've spent the last 6 years of my life in service to God and the law. Today a man tried to destroy both my body and my faith. If we don't stop him, he'll do it to other women, other families. How is that not worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost? Samuel cleared his throat with the nervous energy of someone about to deliver bad news. Mr. Marcus, there's something else you need to know. When I was checking the perimeter defenses earlier, I found fresh tracks heading toward Judge Fletcher's place. Someone's been watching his house too, and the signs suggest they've been there for days. Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place with the ugly clarity of a puzzle revealing its true picture. Garrett wasn't just targeting his ranch in isolation. He was moving systematically against everyone who might stand in the way of his railroad deal. Judge Fletcher, with his federal connections and incorruptible reputation, would be next on the elimination list. Martha, Marcus said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a man accustomed to command in crisis situations, pack provisions for 3 days. Include medical supplies and anything else we might need if we have to move fast. Samuel, check all the weapons and ammunition. Make sure the Winchester is clean and the shotguns loaded with buckshot. Sister Catherine, if you're serious about this alliance, we need to move quickly. Garrett just declared war, and the first rule of war is that you hit back harder than you got hit. Thunder crashed overhead as the first drops of rain began to fall, each one striking the dust of the yard like a musket ball. Through the window, lightning illuminated the prairie in stark black and white, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was just beginning, both meteorologically and metaphorically. 12 years of grief and unanswered questions were about to become a reckoning that would reshape the entire territory. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded remarkably like Ellen's whispered that maybe, just maybe, justice was finally riding toward Dodge City with the thunder and the rain. The silver coin caught lamplight as Marcus set it on the kitchen table between himself and Catherine, a piece of evidence that connected past crimes to present dangers. It represented proof, leverage, and the beginning of the end for Garrett Stone's reign of corruption and violence. Partnership? Marcus asked, extending his weathered hand across the table with the formality of a man sealing a sacred compact. Partnership, Catherine agreed, her grip firm despite everything she'd endured. Her handshake carried the strength of someone who'd made a conscious choice to fight rather than surrender. Outside, the storm gathered strength with the inexorable power of natural forces, and inside Copper Creek Ranch, 2 damaged souls began planning how to bring a reckoning to the man who'd destroyed their lives and threatened their community. The covenant of dust and honor had been sealed in shared purpose and mutual determination. The storm that had threatened all evening finally broke just before dawn, washing the Kansas prairie clean with sheets of rain that drummed against the windows of Copper Creek Ranch like urgent fingers demanding attention. Marcus Sullivan stood at his study window, watching water cascade from the eaves while his mind worked through the implications of what Catherine had revealed the night before. A Harvard-trained lawyer, hidden in nun's clothing, carrying legal knowledge that could dismantle Garrett Stone's entire operation if properly applied. It was the kind of ironic justice that made a man believe in divine providence, even after 12 years of questioning God's plan. Behind him, Catherine sat at his desk, surrounded by legal documents and property records that Martha had retrieved from the ranch's strongbox. Despite the trauma of the previous day, her mind was sharp as a Toledo blade as she analyzed contracts, deeds, and correspondence with the methodical precision of someone trained to find truth buried in paperwork. Mr. Sullivan, she said without looking up from a particularly dense legal document, your instincts about the railroad conspiracy were correct. These property acquisition patterns show systematic fraud dating back at least 3 years. Mr. Stone has been using shell companies, forged documents, and intimidation to acquire land along the proposed route. Marcus turned from the window, noting how the morning light revealed both the extent of Catherine's injuries and the fierce determination in her eyes. Purple bruises circled her throat like a necklace of violence, but her analytical mind was clearly unimpaired. Can you prove it in federal court? With the right evidence and witnesses, yes. But we'll need more than property records. We need testimony from victims, financial documents showing the money trail, and proof of Mr. Stone's personal involvement in the violence. A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Samuel's voice carried urgent news. Mr. Marcus, Judge Fletcher's here. He's got a federal marshal with him, and they're unloading enough supplies for a siege. Marcus and Catherine exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their shared understanding that their local conflict had attracted attention from very high places indeed. Judge Harrison Fletcher stood in the ranch yard, water dripping from his black coat as he supervised the unloading of supplies from a heavily laden wagon. At 68, Fletcher carried himself with the authority of a man who'd spent 40 years interpreting law on the frontier, from territorial courts to federal circuit riding. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who'd seen justice triumph and fail in equal measure. "Marcus," Fletcher called out, his voice carrying the weight of old friendship and new urgency. "We need to talk immediately. This situation has escalated beyond anything I initially imagined." Beside him stood Federal Marshal Thompson from Kansas City, a lean man in his 40s with the careful eyes of someone accustomed to separating truth from elaborate lies. His presence suggested that their local conflict had attracted federal attention at the highest levels. Inside the house, with Martha serving coffee from her best china and keeping vigilant watch at the windows, Fletcher laid out a broader picture that made their situation simultaneously more dangerous and more hopeful than Marcus had dared imagine. "Marcus, what's happening here isn't isolated criminal activity," Fletcher began, spreading an official territorial map across the kitchen table. "We've documented similar patterns of fraud, intimidation, and violence in 6 counties along the proposed railroad route. Federal investigators have been building cases against local agents like Garrett Stone for over a year." Marshal Thompson added his official perspective with the precision of someone accustomed to briefing government officials. "The federal government has significant financial investment in railroad expansion, but not at the cost of ignoring systematic criminality. We've been gathering evidence of interstate conspiracy, but we need local witnesses willing to testify in federal court." Catherine leaned forward, her legal training evident in the sophisticated questions she posed. "Marshal Thompson, what specific federal statutes are we discussing? What's the jurisdictional basis for prosecuting crimes that cross state and territorial boundaries? Interstate commerce violations, federal tax evasion, mail fraud if they've used postal services for fraudulent documents, conspiracy to defraud the United States government," Thompson replied with professional precision. "If we can prove organized criminal enterprise and pattern of racketeering under federal jurisdiction, we're looking at prison sentences that would effectively end their entire operation." Fletcher's weathered face grew increasingly grim as he continued. "But Marcus, you need to understand exactly what we're confronting. Garrett Stone isn't merely some local corrupt politician with delusions of grandeur. He's connected to railroad interests that reach all the way to congressional committees and territorial governors. Taking him down means taking on people with serious political power and unlimited financial resources." Before Marcus could fully process the implications, the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention to the windows. Samuel appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern and recognition. "Mr. Marcus, Tom Murphy's coming in fast from the direction of town. His horse is lathered, and he's riding like the devil himself is chasing him." Tom Murphy burst through the front door like a man carrying news that couldn't wait another second. At 62, the Irish blacksmith was still built like the Union Army armorer he'd once been, with shoulders broad enough to swing a 20-pound hammer all day and hands that could shape steel or handle precision firearms with equal skill. "Marcus, thank the almighty God you're still here," Murphy gasped, his Irish accent thick with urgency and barely controlled rage. "They came for me last night, the bastards. Garrett's hired guns, trying to burn out my shop with me in it. Said I was making too many weapons for farmers who might get ideas about defending their property. Not enough horseshoes for railroad crews." Murphy's revelation added another critical piece to the puzzle of Garrett's systematic campaign. He wasn't just targeting specific individuals who opposed him. He was methodically eliminating anyone who might provide material support to potential resistance. "Tom," Catherine said quietly, rising from her chair with careful dignity, I'm Sister Catherine O'Sullivan. Before I took religious vows, I studied law at Harvard University. My father was Patrick O'Sullivan from County Cork, Ireland. Did you know him during your time in Boston? Murphy's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching reverence as family connections spanning continents and generations suddenly clicked into place. Patrick O'Sullivan's daughter? Jesus, Mary, and Joseph preserve us. You're the one who became a lawyer before joining the church? Child, your father would be proud beyond words to see you now, standing up to evil with both law and faith as your weapons. The immediate bond of trust that formed between Catherine and Murphy transcended their current circumstances. In the world of Irish immigrants scattered across America, family and clan connections carried weight that went beyond simple friendship into the realm of sacred obligation. Tom, Marcus said, understanding that Murphy's arrival represented both opportunity and necessity, we're going to need weapons, ammunition, and tactical expertise if we're going to survive what's coming. Can you help us prepare properly for what promises to be a serious fight? Murphy's grin was fierce as winter wind across the Atlantic. Marcus, my friend, I've been preparing for this fight since the day I opened my shop. Let me show you what real Irish craftsmanship combined with American ingenuity can accomplish. Over the next 2 hours, Murphy transformed the ranch kitchen into an impromptu armory, displaying weapons that represented the finest examples of frontier firearms technology. He worked with the methodical precision of a man who understood that attention to detail could mean the difference between victory and death. Your Colt. 45. Peacemaker, Murphy explained, handling Marcus's familiar sidearm with professional appreciation. I've cleaned and adjusted the action for optimal performance. The cylinder timing is perfect, the trigger pull is smooth at 4 pounds, and I've replaced the firing pin with hardened steel that won't fail under stress. He produced Marcus's Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle, the weapon gleaming with fresh oil and meticulous care. I've modified the action for faster cycling, adjusted the sights for accuracy out to 300 yards, and smoothed the lever throw so you can work the action without taking the rifle down from your shoulder. With the right ammunition, you can drop a man at distances most folks can't even see clearly. Murphy opened a wooden box revealing custom-loaded cartridges that demonstrated both his technical expertise and his understanding of different tactical situations. These are soft-point bullets designed for maximum stopping power. They'll expand on impact, creating devastating wound channels that put men down permanently. For close-quarters work, Murphy had prepared a Remington 10-gauge shotgun that would clear a room with authority. 9 .32 caliber lead balls per shell, he explained to Samuel, who was absorbing every technical detail with the intensity of someone who understood his life might depend on this knowledge. At ranges under 20 yards, this weapon is absolutely devastating to multiple opponents. But Murphy's true masterpiece was a collection of specialized ammunition that demonstrated both his innovative thinking and his deep understanding of tactical requirements in different combat situations. Signal flares for emergency communication, he said, showing Catherine small brass cartridges that could be fired from the Winchester. These will burn bright red for 30 seconds, visible for miles in clear weather. If you're separated from allies and need immediate help, fire one straight up. And these beauties, Murphy continued with obvious pride, are frangible rounds designed specifically to minimize overpenetration. If you must shoot in confined spaces where innocent people might be positioned behind your target, these bullets will fragment on impact rather than punching through walls and potentially striking someone you're trying to protect. Catherine studied the ammunition with the same analytical attention she'd given to complex legal documents. Mr. Murphy, you've essentially created a complete tactical system adapted to different combat scenarios. Aye, that I have, child. 40 years of experience in war and peace taught me that having the right tool for the specific job can mean the difference between going home to your family and being carried home on a pine board. Murphy's wisdom extended far beyond weapons technology. As he worked, methodically checking each firearm and explaining its capabilities, he shared insights that came from decades of surviving in an unforgiving land where violence was often the final arbiter of disputes. Catherine, my dear, he said while carefully adjusting the sights on a smaller Colt revolver more suitable for her hands, remember this truth that your father knew well. A person is judged by what they create, not by what they destroy. But sometimes, to protect innocent creation, We must be willing to destroy deliberate evil. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Margaret Hayes, who came riding up to the ranch with the controlled urgency of a medical professional responding to a crisis that demanded immediate attention. At 35, Dr. Hayes represented the new generation of educated women who were carving out professional roles in traditionally male domains through sheer competence and determination. "I came as soon as word reached me," she announced, dismounting with practiced efficiency while her medical bag remained securely strapped to her saddle. "Sister Catherine, I need to examine you properly and document your injuries using the latest medical techniques. If we're building a federal case against Garrett Stone, medical evidence will be absolutely crucial to establishing the pattern of violence." Catherine submitted to the examination with the stoic acceptance of someone who understood that justice sometimes required facing uncomfortable truths and preserving evidence that would rather be forgotten. Dr. Hayes worked with professional competence, using the most advanced 1885 medical techniques to document evidence that would withstand scrutiny in federal court. "The injuries are entirely consistent with violent sexual assault," Dr. Hayes concluded, her voice carefully controlled but carrying undertones of barely suppressed rage. "I can provide expert testimony about the nature, severity, and timing of the trauma, but Sister Catherine, you should know that you're not the first victim I've been called upon to treat." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, changing everything about how they understood Garrett's criminal activities. "In the past 2 years alone, I've treated 3 other women with remarkably similar injuries. 2 were too frightened to identify their attacker, despite my encouragement to seek legal recourse. The third was approached by representatives of certain business interests and paid a very significant sum to leave the territory permanently with a promise never to return." Catherine absorbed this information with the analytical mind of someone trained to recognize patterns in seemingly isolated events. "Dr. Hayes, would these other women be willing to testify in federal court if they understood they weren't alone? That there was genuine legal protection available and a realistic chance of seeing justice served? Possibly, if they truly believed that justice was actually achievable and that they wouldn't face deadly retaliation for speaking the truth." Dr. Hayes's father, Captain Robert Hayes, arrived as his daughter was concluding her medical examination. At 64, the Civil War veteran carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd commanded troops through some of the bloodiest battles in American history, from Antietam to Gettysburg. His presence brought tactical expertise that would prove invaluable in the coming confrontation. "Gentlemen, ladies," Captain Hayes announced without preamble, his voice carrying the authority of long command and hard-won experience. "I've spent the morning conducting reconnaissance around Judge Fletcher's residence and Tom Murphy's smithy. Garrett Stone has positioned armed men to maintain surveillance on both locations. This isn't random harassment or casual intimidation anymore. This is systematic military-style operation with coordinated command structure." The captain spread a detailed hand-drawn map across the table, showing positions and movement patterns with the precision of someone who'd spent years reading terrain and enemy intentions for the United States Army. "Stone has at least 15 men under arms, organized into 4 distinct groups. One watches the town and courthouse, another covers all approaches to this ranch, a third maintains surveillance on potential allies, and a mobile reserve group that can respond rapidly to threats or opportunities." Marcus studied the tactical situation with the analytical eye of a former sheriff who dealt with organized criminal activity during the worst years of frontier lawlessness. "Captain Hayes, what kind of training and experience are we looking at? Professional gunmen or just local toughs hired for intimidation?" "Mixed composition from what I observed during 6 hours of careful surveillance. Some are clearly experienced fighters, probably hired muscle from Kansas City or St. Louis with genuine combat experience. Others appear to be local men who have been either bought or intimidated into service. The dangerous ones are the professionals who know their business. The local recruits might break and run when the shooting starts in earnest." Samuel, who'd been listening intently to every tactical detail, raised a question that demonstrated his growing maturity and leadership potential. "Captain, if this escalates into open warfare, how do we protect innocent civilians in town? Garrett's shown he doesn't care about collateral damage when it serves his purposes." Captain Hayes nodded approvingly at the thoughtful question. "That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates good leaders from men who just know how to fight, son. The answer is that we cannot allow this to become an indiscriminate battle. We must be smarter, more precise, and more disciplined than our opponents while maintaining moral authority. As the group developed comprehensive strategy combining legal action with tactical preparation, their planning was interrupted by news from an unexpected but crucial source. Samuel returned from a perimeter check with a young companion who would change everything they thought they knew about their situation. "Mr. Marcus," Samuel said, "this is Jake Morrison. He says he used to work for you when you were sheriff, and he's got information you need to hear immediately." Jake Morrison stood in the kitchen doorway like a man emerging from 12 years of shadows. At 31, he bore the weathered appearance of someone who'd lived rough and kept constantly moving. But his eyes held the intelligence Marcus remembered from their time working together, and his presence represented possibilities that Marcus had never dared to hope for. "Marcus," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying years of accumulated guilt and determination, "I know you probably figured I was dead or run off after the fire. Truth is, I've been hiding ever since that night, too scared to come forward with what I knew." Marcus studied his former deputy with the careful attention of someone who'd learned not to trust too readily, but was desperate for allies. "Jake, if you've got information about what happened to Ellen and Mary, I need to hear it now." Jake reached into his worn coat and withdrew a small metal key. "Marcus, I've got the evidence you were gathering 12 years ago, all of it, hidden where Garrett could never find it, preserved and waiting for the day when justice might actually be possible." The revelation hit the room like lightning. Marcus had assumed all his investigative work had been destroyed in the fire that killed his family. "The night before your house burned," Jake continued, "you gave me a metal strongbox containing all the financial records, witness statements, and correspondence proving Garrett's corruption. You said if anything happened to you, I should take it to federal authorities. When the fire happened and you survived, I was too terrified of Garrett's reach to come forward. I've been carrying that guilt for 12 years. Catherine leaned forward with the intense focus of someone who understood the legal implications. "Mr. Morrison, are you saying you have documented evidence of Mr. Stone's criminal activities dating back over a decade? Financial records showing systematic theft of county tax money, correspondence with railroad representatives planning fraudulent land acquisitions, witness statements from business owners who were extorted, and proof that several suspicious deaths weren't accidents," Jake confirmed. "Everything Marcus needed to put Garrett in federal prison, preserved exactly as it was 12 years ago." Judge Fletcher's eyes lit up with the satisfaction of a man who'd spent 40 years waiting for exactly this kind of breakthrough. "Mr. Morrison, if this evidence is authentic and legally admissible, it could form the foundation of a federal racketeering case that would destroy Garrett Stone's entire criminal organization." But Jake's most shocking revelation was yet to come. "There's something else, Marcus, something I discovered 3 months ago that made me finally decide to come out of hiding." He paused, clearly struggling with information that was difficult to share. "Ellen and Mary might still be alive." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. For a moment, the kitchen went absolutely silent, except for the ticking of Martha's mantel clock and the sound of rain against the windows. "That's impossible," Marcus whispered. "I saw their bodies. We buried them." "You saw 2 bodies burned beyond recognition," Jake corrected gently. "Bodies that were identified based on where they were found, not on actual physical evidence. I've been tracking rumors and following leads for months, and I found evidence of a remote compound 20 miles north where Garrett's been keeping captives for years." Catherine's legal mind immediately grasped the implications. If Mr. Stone has been holding hostages to ensure compliance and prevent retaliation, it would explain how he's maintained control over potential witnesses for so long. Jake nodded grimly. "It gets worse. I have reason to believe there are other captives besides Ellen and Mary. Women who've disappeared over the years, families who've vanished after opposing Garrett's plans. He's been using them as insurance policies against anyone who might threaten his operation." The tactical situation had suddenly become infinitely more complex. Rescuing hostages would require entirely different planning than simply building a legal case or preparing for defensive action. Captain Hayes immediately began calculating the military implications. If there are hostages being held at a fortified location, any rescue attempt becomes exponentially more dangerous. We'd need precise intelligence about guards, layout, and security measures. I've been watching the compound for weeks, Jake said. I can draw detailed maps showing guard positions, shift changes, and potential approach routes. But Marcus, you need to understand that attempting a rescue would expose all of us and give Garrett excuse to eliminate everyone who opposes him. Marcus felt the weight of an impossible decision settling on his shoulders. Pursue justice through legal channels while his family might be suffering in captivity? Or risk everything on a rescue mission that could end in disaster for everyone involved? There's a third option, Catherine said quietly, her legal training evident in her systematic analysis of their situation. We coordinate both actions simultaneously. File federal charges to tie up Garrett's resources and attention while conducting rescue operations. It's more dangerous, but it's the only way to achieve both justice and mercy. Samuel stepped forward with the determination of someone ready to accept adult responsibilities. Mr. Marcus, whatever you decide, I'm with you. Ellen and Mary are family to me too. As the group continued planning through the afternoon, word arrived that Garrett's psychological warfare campaign was escalating beyond surveillance and intimidation. Martha returned from a trip to town with disturbing news about rumor campaigns designed to destroy Catherine's credibility and isolate potential allies. They're saying terrible things about Sister Catherine, Martha reported with barely controlled anger, claiming she seduced local men and fled the convent in disgrace. Some are even suggesting the attack never happened, that she's mentally unstable and making false accusations. The systematic character assassination was clearly designed to make it impossible for Catherine to receive fair treatment in local courts or community support for her cause. But Garrett's campaign had an unexpected effect. It began mobilizing community members who'd previously remained neutral. Dr. Hayes reported that several women had privately approached her, expressing willingness to support Catherine if there was genuine legal protection available. The problem, Dr. Hayes explained, is that most people are too frightened of economic retaliation to speak publicly. Garrett controls too many jobs and business relationships for open opposition to be safe. This led to Catherine's most audacious, strategic decision of the entire conflict. I propose we force the issue, she announced with quiet steel in her voice. Sunday service at the community church. I'll make a public statement about the assault and challenge Garrett to respond. Either the community will rally to support justice or we'll know exactly where we stand. The proposal was breathtakingly dangerous. Public confrontation would expose Catherine to maximum risk while giving Garrett every advantage of local support and preparation time. Sister Catherine, Judge Fletcher said carefully, you're essentially proposing to bet everything on the moral courage of people who've been intimidated into silence for years. If the community doesn't support you, you'll be completely isolated and vulnerable. Judge Fletcher, Catherine replied with the conviction of someone who'd found her calling, I didn't survive yesterday's attack to spend the rest of my life hiding from the truth. If we don't stand up publicly for what's right, then we're just another criminal conspiracy operating in shadows. Marcus realized that Catherine's proposal represented exactly the kind of moral courage that separated civilization from frontier barbarism. It was dangerous beyond measure, but it was also the only way to truly win rather than simply survive. All right, he said with finality, Sunday service it is, but we do this properly, with backup plans and security measures that give us the best possible chance of success. As evening approached and the group continued refining their plans, Samuel returned from another reconnaissance mission with news that raised the stakes even higher. Mr. Marcus, Sheriff Crawford's heading this way with 6 deputies. They're flying official colors, but I recognize 2 of Garrett's hired guns riding with them. The corruption of local law enforcement meant that legal authority could be used as cover for criminal action. Crawford was clearly positioning himself to arrest Catherine on fabricated charges, removing her from the equation entirely. That's it, Marshal Thompson declared, finally stepping fully into his federal role. Sheriff Crawford is interfering with a federal investigation. I'm placing him under arrest and assuming law enforcement authority for this jurisdiction. The confrontation that followed would determine whether federal law or local corruption would prevail in their corner of Kansas. And somewhere 20 miles north, if Jake Morrison was correct, Marcus's family waited in captivity for a rescue that might never come. As storm clouds gathered again on the horizon, the covenant of dust and honor was about to face its most severe test. The next 24 hours would determine whether justice was still possible on the American frontier, or whether corruption and violence had won permanently. The silver dollar on the kitchen table caught lamplight one more time, a reminder that some debts could only be paid in full through courage, sacrifice, and the determination to do what was right, regardless of the personal cost. The confrontation with Sheriff Crawford came at dawn, when the Kansas sky was painted crimson and gold like the aftermath of battle. Marcus Sullivan stood on his front porch, watching 6 riders approach Copper Creek Ranch under the false banner of legal authority. Behind the badges and official posturing, he recognized the cold reality of corruption, wearing the mask of law enforcement. Sheriff Daniel Crawford rode at the head of the group, his face set in the grim lines of a man who'd convinced himself that necessity justified betrayal. At 41, Crawford had once been an honest lawman, but marriage into Garrett Stone's family had gradually corrupted both his judgment and his conscience. Now he served 2 masters, and Marcus could see the internal conflict written in every line of his posture. "Marcus Sullivan," Crawford called out as the rider stopped in the yard. "I have warrants for the arrest of the woman calling herself Sister Catherine O'Sullivan. She's wanted for questioning in connection with theft from the convent in Abilene and making false accusations against prominent citizens." The fabricated charges were so transparently designed to remove Catherine from the conflict that Marcus almost laughed at their crude obviousness. But the 6 armed men backing Crawford's play made the situation deadly serious regardless of the legal fiction involved. "Daniel," Marcus said with the calm authority of someone who'd once been Crawford's superior officer, "you and I both know those warrants aren't worth the paper they're written on. The question is whether you're going to compound your mistakes by trying to enforce them." Before Crawford could respond, Federal Marshal Thompson emerged from the ranch house with the full authority of the United States government behind him. At his appearance, the dynamic of the confrontation shifted dramatically toward legitimate law enforcement. "Sheriff Crawford," Thompson announced in a voice that carried across the yard with unmistakable authority, "you are hereby ordered to stand down. This jurisdiction is now under federal control, pending investigation of criminal conspiracy and interference with interstate commerce." Crawford's face went pale as he realized that his local political protection meant nothing against federal intervention. But the 2 hired gunmen riding with his deputies clearly had different loyalties than respect for legal authority. The standoff that followed lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but in that time, Marcus saw the future of their entire struggle balanced on the edge of a knife. If Crawford backed down, federal law would prevail. If he chose to resist, blood would flow before breakfast, and their chances of achieving justice through legal means would be destroyed. "Marshal," Crawford said finally, his voice tight with defeat, "I'll be filing formal complaints about federal overreach with the territorial governor." "You do that," Thompson replied with professional courtesy, masking steel resolve. "In the meantime, you and your men will return to town and confine your activities to matters that don't interfere with ongoing federal investigations." As Crawford's group retreated with wounded dignity, Catherine appeared beside Marcus on the porch. Despite everything she'd endured, her bearing carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd discovered inner strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Mr. Sullivan," she said quietly, "it's time to implement our plan for Sunday service. If we're going to force this conflict into the open, we need to do it before Mr. Stone has time to adapt to federal involvement." Marcus nodded, understanding that delay would only give Garrett more opportunities to eliminate threats or move hostages beyond reach. The window for decisive action was closing rapidly. Over the next 24 hours, their makeshift alliance transformed into a coordinated operation that would have impressed military planners. Captain Hayes took charge of tactical preparations, while Judge Fletcher and Marshal Thompson handled legal documentation. Catherine worked with Dr. Hayes to prepare medical evidence, while Jake Morrison refined intelligence about the compound where hostages might be held. But the most critical development was Samuel's growth from follower to leader. Marcus had spent 12 years teaching the young man everything he knew about courage, justice, and responsibility. Now he watched Samuel coordinate security preparations with the competence of someone ready to inherit the burden of protecting others. "Samuel," Marcus said during a quiet moment between planning sessions, Tomorrow we're going to ask people to choose between right and wrong and under the most difficult circumstances possible. Some will stand with us. Others will fail that test. But regardless of what happens to me, I need you to promise that you'll continue fighting for what we believe in. Samuel's response carried the weight of a man accepting his destiny. Mr. Marcus, you taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accomplishes for himself, but by what he makes possible for others. I understand what you're asking, and I give you my word. The conversation was interrupted by Tommy Martinez, who burst into the kitchen with information that changed their understanding of the entire situation. Senor Marcus, Tommy gasped in rapid English, mixed with excitement. I know secret way to the compound where the bad men keep prisoners. My grandfather, he dug tunnels when they built the church, and one tunnel goes under the ground all the way to the old mine workings near where Senor Jake says the compound is. The revelation that there might be a covert approach to the hostage location opened tactical possibilities that hadn't existed before. If they could access the compound without fighting through perimeter defenses, rescue operations became significantly more feasible. Jake Morrison studied Tommy's hand-drawn map with the intensity of someone whose life depended on accurate intelligence. The boy's right about the geography. I never noticed the old mine entrance because it's hidden by rock falls and overgrowth. But if there's a tunnel system connecting to it, we could approach the compound from an entirely unexpected direction. Captain Hayes immediately grasped the military implications. Surprise is the most valuable tactical asset we can have. If Garrett's people don't know we're coming until we're already inside their perimeter, we can neutralize guards and secure hostages before they can mount organized resistance. But Catherine raised a legal consideration that complicated every aspect of their planning. Gentlemen, we need to be very careful about how we conduct any rescue operation. If we act outside legal authority, we could compromise the federal case and give Mr. Stone's lawyers grounds for dismissal of all charges. Judge Fletcher provided the legal framework that made coordinated action possible. If Marshal Thompson issues federal warrants for the arrest of Garrett Stone and his associates on charges of kidnapping and interstate criminal conspiracy, then any rescue operation becomes legitimate law enforcement action rather than vigilante justice. The complexity of coordinating simultaneous legal and military action would have been daunting under the best of circumstances, but they were operating under time pressure that made careful planning nearly impossible. Garrett wouldn't remain passive indefinitely, and every hour of delay increased the danger to potential hostages. Their planning reached crisis point when Dr. Hayes returned from town with news that changed Catherine's personal situation dramatically. Sister Catherine, Dr. Hayes said with the careful precision of someone delivering medical information that would affect major decisions, the examination results confirm what I suspected. Early examination suggests you may be pregnant as a result of the assault, though it's too soon to be certain. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Catherine's face went white, but her voice remained steady as she processed information that would reshape her entire future. Dr. Hayes, what are my medical options given the circumstances and the dangers we're facing? In your condition, participating in any kind of violent confrontation would be extremely risky, but I also understand that this may be your only opportunity to see justice served against the man who attacked you. Catherine was quiet for several minutes, clearly working through implications that went far beyond immediate tactical concerns. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that would define the rest of her life. This child was conceived through violence, but that doesn't make the child evil. If we succeed in bringing Mr. Stone to justice, this baby will grow up in a world where such crimes are punished rather than ignored. That's worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. Her decision to continue both the pregnancy and the fight against Garrett demonstrated moral courage that impressed even the veteran soldiers among their group. As Saturday evening approached, final preparations took on the urgency of people who understood they might not survive to see another sunset. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, evidence was secured in multiple locations, escape routes were planned and rehearsed. Most importantly, each person made peace with the possibility that they might not survive the coming confrontation. Martha Wilson, who'd remained largely in the background during the tactical planning, emerged as a crucial figure in the final preparations. Her knowledge of local families and community dynamics provided intelligence that no amount of military reconnaissance could have supplied. "There are good people in this town who've been silent too long," Martha said with the certainty of someone who'd lived through 40 years of frontier politics. "Tomorrow, when Sister Catherine speaks the truth publicly, some of them will find courage they didn't know they possessed." The prediction proved accurate in ways none of them anticipated. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant objects seem close enough to touch. The community church was fuller than it had been in months, as word of the coming confrontation had spread through Dodge City like wildfire. People came not just from religious conviction, but from the human need to witness history being made. Marcus surveyed the congregation as they filed into the simple wooden building, noting allies, enemies, and those whose loyalties remained unknown. Garrett Stone sat in his customary front pew, surrounded by family members and business associates who formed a wall of respectability around his criminal activities. Catherine entered the church with quiet dignity, walking between Marcus and Judge Fletcher in a formation that spoke of legal authority and moral support. Her simple dress and modest bearing contrasted sharply with the elaborate clothing of Garrett's supporters, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose. The service proceeded normally until Pastor William Bennett, a man of 50 who'd spent 20 years trying to balance spiritual calling with political reality, invited Catherine to address the congregation. The invitation had been arranged through Judge Fletcher's influence, but Bennett's willingness to provide the platform demonstrated courage that hadn't been evident before. Catherine walked to the front of the church with measured steps, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. The silence that fell over the congregation was absolute, broken only by the sound of wind through the windows and the distant call of a meadowlark. "Friends and neighbors," Catherine began, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the church, "I stand before you today not as Sister Catherine the nun, but as Catherine O'Sullivan, graduate of Harvard Law School and witness to crimes that threaten the safety of every family in this community." The formal introduction established her credibility and legal authority in terms that even hostile listeners couldn't easily dismiss. "3 days ago, I was traveling from Abilene to Dodge City when I was attacked, brutalized, and left for dead by a man whose name is known to everyone in this congregation. I survived that attack through God's grace and the kindness of Marcus Sullivan, who risked his own safety to provide shelter and protection." Catherine's voice remained steady as she described the assault in clinical terms that focused on facts rather than emotional manipulation. Her legal training was evident in the way she presented evidence methodically, building a case that would be difficult to refute. "But my assault was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of criminal activity designed to intimidate anyone who might oppose the illegal seizure of land along the proposed railroad route. Federal investigators have documented similar crimes in 6 counties, all connected to the same criminal conspiracy." Garrett Stone's face had gone pale, but he remained seated with the rigid composure of someone who'd faced accusations before and survived them through political connections and community influence. Catherine continued her testimony, describing the medical evidence, the silver dollar found in her saddlebag, and the systematic campaign of intimidation that had followed her survival. But her most devastating revelation was yet to come. Furthermore, federal marshals have evidence that Garrett Stone has been operating a compound 20 miles north of town where kidnapping victims are held as hostages to ensure the silence of their families. Among these hostages may be Ellen and Mary Sullivan, who were supposed to have died in a house fire 12 years ago. The revelation sent shockwaves through the congregation. Murmurs of disbelief and horror rippled through the assembled community members as they processed information that challenged everything they'd believed about a tragedy that had shaped local history. Garrett Stone rose from his pew with the cold fury of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling in public. "These accusations are the ravings of a disturbed woman who's clearly suffered some kind of mental breakdown. I demand that this travesty be ended immediately." But before he could continue his denial, a voice from the back of the church cut through his protests with the authority of first-hand knowledge. "She's telling the truth." Samuel Mitchell stood up from his seat near the rear door, his young face set with determination that had been 12 years in the making. "Mr. Stone, I was 11 years old when I saw you leaving the Sullivan place the night of the fire. I was too scared then to tell anyone what I'd seen, but I'm not scared anymore. The testimony from someone who'd been present at the original crime transformed the dynamic of Catherine's accusations from distant legal theory to immediate personal reality. Another voice joined Samuel's from across the church. I saw it too. Tommy Martinez stood up despite his youth, his voice carrying across the silence with startling clarity. Senor Stone and two other men, they were at the mine compound last month when my father delivered supplies. I saw women in the buildings, women who looked like prisoners. The corroborating testimony from multiple witnesses created a cascade effect that Garrett couldn't stop or control. Mother Harry Hayes rose to confirm her medical evidence. Captain Hayes spoke about the military-style organization of Garrett's hired gunmen. Even some community members who'd previously remained silent began to find courage in the collective revelation of truth. But Garrett Stone's most devastating blow came from an entirely unexpected source. Jake Morrison entered the church from the side door, carrying the metal strongbox that contained 12 years of preserved evidence. His appearance sent visible shock through Garrett, who'd clearly believed his former deputy was dead or permanently silenced. Garrett, Jake announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the building, I've got every document Marcus collected about your crimes 12 years ago. Financial records, correspondence, witness statements proving your guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. It's time to face justice for what you've done. The combined weight of testimony, evidence, and community support created a momentum that even Garrett's political connections couldn't stop. Federal Marshal Thompson stepped forward with arrest warrants that had been prepared in advance, backed by the full authority of the United States government. But Garrett Stone didn't become a powerful criminal through accepting defeat gracefully. You fools, he snarled, his mask of respectability finally dropping completely. Do you think you can destroy everything I've built with courtroom theatrics and sentimental speeches? I own half the territorial government and most of the railroad board. This changes nothing. His defiance sparked the violent confrontation that everyone had feared but hoped to avoid. Garrett's hired gunmen, who'd been positioned throughout the congregation, began reaching for their weapons with the cold professionalism of men who'd killed before without hesitation. But they'd underestimated both the preparation of their opponents and the moral courage of ordinary citizens who'd finally been pushed too far. Marcus Sullivan's Colt appeared in his hand with the smooth speed of 30 years' practice, while Captain Hayes and his military-trained reflexes neutralized the nearest threat before the hired gun could clear leather. Throughout the church, community members who'd seemed like helpless civilians revealed themselves as armed citizens prepared to defend their neighbors. The gunfight that followed was brief but decisive. Garrett's professional killers were skilled, but they were outnumbered by local people fighting to protect their families and their community. When the smoke cleared, 3 of Garrett's men were dead, 2 were wounded and captured, and Garrett himself stood surrounded by federal marshals with nowhere left to run. But the victory in the church was only the beginning of their challenge. Even as Garrett was being arrested, word reached the church that his remaining associates had barricaded themselves at the compound where hostages were being held. The rescue mission that had been planned as a coordinated operation now became an emergency race against time. They know we're coming now, Jake Morrison reported grimly. If Ellen and Mary are really being held there, Garrett's people might kill them, rather than let them be rescued as witnesses. Captain Hayes immediately took charge of the tactical situation with military efficiency. We have 2 options: systematic siege that minimizes risk, but gives them time to eliminate evidence and hostages, or immediate assault that maximizes danger but offers the best chance of rescue. Marcus didn't hesitate. We go now, fast and hard. If my family's been suffering for 12 years because I wasn't strong enough to save them the first time, I'm not going to fail them again. The ride to the compound became a desperate race between justice and revenge, hope and tragedy. Marcus pushed his horse to the limit across 20 miles of broken country, followed by Samuel, Jake, Captain Hayes, and a dozen volunteers from the church congregation who decided that some fights were worth the ultimate sacrifice. The compound, when it reached it, proved to be exactly what Jake's intelligence had suggested: a fortified ranch complex surrounded by wooden walls and guard towers, designed more like a prison than a legitimate business operation. Smoke rising from the central buildings suggested that Garrett's remaining associates were destroying evidence as quickly as possible. The assault that followed combined military tactics with desperate improvisation. Tommy Martinez led Marcus and Samuel through the tunnel system his grandfather had described, emerging inside the compound perimeter, while Captain Hayes led a diversionary frontal attack that drew the defenders' attention. Inside the main building, Marcus found them. Ellen Sullivan, 47 years old but appearing much older after 12 years of captivity, was chained to a wall in a basement room that smelled of fear and desperation. Beside her, Mary Sullivan had grown from the 8-year-old child Marcus remembered into a 20-year-old woman whose eyes held horrors he could barely comprehend. "Marcus," Ellen whispered, her voice hoarse from years of broken hope. "I knew you'd come. I never stopped believing you'd find us." The reunion was everything Marcus had dreamed of and more heartbreaking than his worst nightmares. Ellen and Mary were alive, but the vibrant, happy family he'd lost had been destroyed by 12 years of trauma that could never be completely healed. But they were alive. And alive meant there was hope for healing, for justice, and for rebuilding something meaningful from the wreckage of the past. The rescue operation uncovered evidence that went far beyond Marcus's personal tragedy. 7 other women were being held in similar conditions, victims of a kidnapping operation that had supplied leverage over their families for years. The compound also contained financial records and correspondence that documented criminal conspiracy, reaching from local corruption all the way to railroad boardrooms in New York and Washington. The aftermath of the Sunday confrontation reshaped the entire territory in ways that none of them had fully anticipated. Garrett Stone's conviction on federal charges led to investigations that exposed corruption throughout the territorial government. The railroad expansion continued, but under federal oversight that ensured fair compensation for landowners and legal acquisition procedures. Catherine's decision to remain in Dodge City rather than return to the convent created the foundation for legal reforms that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Working with Judge Fletcher and federal authorities, she established legal precedents for protecting women's rights and prosecuting sexual assault cases that influenced territorial law for decades. Her marriage to Marcus, 18 months later, conducted beside the Arkansas River under cottonwood trees that whispered approval in the wind, represented more than personal happiness. It symbolized the possibility of building new families and new hope from the ashes of old tragedies. The child born of violence but raised in love became a symbol of redemption that inspired the entire community. Growing up surrounded by people who'd fought for justice and won, the boy developed into a young man who understood that courage and moral conviction could overcome even the most deeply rooted corruption. Samuel's appointment as sheriff at age 25 made him the youngest law enforcement officer in county history, but his moral authority had been established through the crucible of the Sunday confrontation. His marriage to Mary Sullivan, despite the trauma she'd endured, demonstrated that love could heal even the deepest wounds given sufficient time and patience. The final scene of their story took place 5 years after the confrontation at the church, during a summer evening gathering at Copper Creek Ranch. 3 generations sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of peace earned through struggle. Marcus, now 59 but looking younger than he had in years, held Catherine's second child while discussing ranch management with Samuel, who'd grown into the kind of leader Marcus had always hoped he could become. Ellen, slowly recovering her strength and spirit, worked on a quilt with Mary and Catherine that would be passed down through generations as a reminder of survival and hope. "Marcus," Judge Fletcher said during one of his regular visits, "you've accomplished something remarkable here. You've proven that ordinary people can defeat systematic corruption when they're willing to stand together for what's right." But Marcus's response reflected the wisdom he'd gained through years of loss and recovery. "Harrison, we didn't win because we were stronger or smarter than our enemies. We won because we remembered that some things are worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Family, justice, truth, the kind of world we want to leave for our children." Catherine's contribution to the conversation carried the legal perspective that had made their victory possible. And we won because we understood that real justice requires both courage and law, both individual heroism and collective action. Neither alone would have been sufficient. As evening deepened into night and the family gathering gradually dispersed, Marcus found himself alone on the porch with the two women who'd shaped his understanding of love and loss. Ellen, slowly healing from 12 years of trauma, sat beside Catherine, who transformed from victim to prosecutor to partner in the space of a single year. Marcus, Ellen said quietly, I know this isn't the life any of us planned, but maybe it's the life we needed to understand what really matters. Catherine nodded agreement. I spent 6 years in the convent believing I was serving God through prayer and contemplation. But I learned that sometimes God's work requires us to fight evil directly, using whatever tools and talents we've been given. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats that no longer carried the threat of violence. Samuel returned from his evening patrol, representing the next generation of men who'd learned that strength meant protecting others rather than dominating them. All quiet in town, Samuel reported, dismounting with the easy competence of someone who'd grown from traumatized boy to confident leader. Mrs. Henderson's cow got loose again, and there was a minor dispute about property lines that I settled with more diplomacy than gunplay. The mundane nature of his report represented everything they'd fought to achieve. A community where law enforcement dealt with ordinary problems rather than systematic corruption, where families could live without fear, and where justice was available to everyone, regardless of their political connections or economic status. As the last light faded from the western sky and stars began to appear in the vast Kansas darkness, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment of hard-won peace. 12 years of grief and unanswered questions had been resolved not through revenge, but through the patient application of law and justice. Catherine's courage in speaking truth to power had created the foundation for legal reforms that protected future victims. The community's willingness to stand together against intimidation had proven that ordinary citizens could defeat organized corruption when they refused to be silenced by fear. But perhaps most importantly, they demonstrated that healing was possible, even from the most devastating losses, that new families could be built from the survivors of old tragedies, and that love could grow in soil watered by tears and struggle. The silver dollar that had started their investigation now sat in a place of honor on the mantle, not as a trophy of victory, but as a reminder of the price of justice and the importance of never forgetting the lessons learned through suffering. As Marcus extinguished the lamps and prepared to join his family inside the house that had been rebuilt stronger than before, he whispered a prayer of gratitude for second chances, for the courage of good people in dark times, and for the possibility of justice in a world that often seemed to reward only the strong and the ruthless. The covenant of dust and honor had been fulfilled through sacrifice, courage, and the determination to do what was right regardless of the personal cost. And in the quiet darkness of the Kansas night, that seemed like enough. The story of their struggle would be told for generations, not as a tale of heroic individuals, but as proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary justice when they stood together for truth, courage, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. That, Marcus realized as sleep finally claimed him, was a legacy worth leaving for the children who would inherit the world they'd fought to improve.